Hey y'all, it's Bo and welcome back to my channel. I am a registered dietitian and homemaker. One of the big goals of my channel is to help bridge the gap between knowing what's healthy and having the skills to actually put it into action on a day-to-day basis and make it realistic and achievable. Today I'm teaching you how to make beef stew. This is a very special recipe. This whole video is dedicated to my grandmother Irma, but it's really delicious and I think you will highly enjoy it. So with this recipe, I recommend getting all of the ingredients ready to go and have them cut up and out on your counter when you start making it, because it will make it a lot easier as you go along. So I'm going to take you through this step by step. I'm going to show you how I cut up the vegetables. That's a really big part of having a well-rounded stew, is knowing how to cut things, when to add them so that they don't cook down to complete mush, so that there's still some color, all of those things. And some of those things she did not actually teach me because none of that was translated through the original recipe, but those are things I learned over time after making it. So let's talk about the ingredients that you need. The recipe that I have is scaled to 1 pound of beef stew meat. When I make it, I always make more than 1 pound. So just double it if you want to make 2 pounds. Today I'm making 1.5 pounds because that's all I had in my freezer. So I'm kind of just going in between, and you'll see I'm gonna wing the measurements a little bit, but if you want to follow exact, I have the exact recipe written out on my blog. This video is really just to help you with some of the techniques that you need in order to make stew. Let's get started. I'm going to show you how I've cut up the ingredients, and then I will take you along through each step as I make the stew. Okay, so ingredients. Beef stew, mine's in the fridge right now. I didn't want to have it out on the counter. I like to cut it up into really small bite-sized pieces. So when I bring it home from the grocery store, I often will cut it up in half or fourths just to get really small, nice little bite-sized pieces, and you'll see what it looks like once I start cooking it. The other ingredients that you'll need, so I use arrowroot starch as my thickener because I like to keep it gluten-free. There's some people in my family that eat gluten-free. Her original recipe used white flour, so if that's all you have, that will work fine. But we have been using arrowroot starch and it works great too. Tapioca starch would probably work well, cornstarch, any kind of thickener will work. I'm gonna be using tomato sauce. That's another ingredient you will need. So you use 16 ounces per pound. So there's 16 ounces used per pound. I only have a 17 ounce amount, so it's gonna be a little bit less tomatoey, but I've tried it without using this before and just using petite diced tomatoes or diced tomatoes, and that works well. So if you get heartburn easily from these really dense tomato products, you can sub the tomato sauce for diced tomatoes and it will still be really good. It will just have a less tomatoey base flavor. I'm gonna be using broth. This is beef broth that I have from my freezer. Honestly, I've used chicken broth before and it works just fine. Of course, beef broth is the best option since you're making beef stew. But this is just some that I made, and this is a 2-cup container, and I probably won't really need more than that. You'd be surprised. You don't need a whole lot of liquid when you are making stew. I have like some little cube broth chunks in my freezer that I can also use if I need to add more liquid to the stew. Celery is an ingredient you will use. So today I'm using dehydrated celery, and I'm not using a lot because in my past experience with dehydrated celery, it has a very strong flavor and it makes everything taste like celery. So I'm not using a lot, and I hope that it doesn't mess up my stew. I recommend using fresh, if you have it, usually about 3 to 4 stalks with some leaves chopped up fine is what you want. I'll be using some fresh parsley, and if I feel like I want more, I can add a little bit of dried. If you don't have fresh, you can use dried. 1 small onion per pound. So if you're doing 2 pounds, you need 2. I just did 1 large onion to work for 1.5 pounds. Cabbage. So 1/4 of a head of cabbage per pound of meat. So I did a little bit less than half. So as you can see, you can kind of wiggle with some of these ingredients and it will still work out really well. It's more about the technique of cooking it. So cabbage is gonna cook down to nothing. You won't even know that there's cabbage in this stew, I promise, and your kids probably won't either. So that's a really cool thing. So I use a blend of potatoes and turnips in my stew. Her original recipe only called for potatoes, but I thought it was a really cool opportunity to diversify the amount of vegetables in the stew and add in some turnips. You could do all potatoes, you could do all turnips, it will work out great. And most people do not know that the turnips are turnips. They think that they're potatoes. So it's a really cool way to add in more nutrients. I'll also be using carrots. So I just have a blend of the heirloom colorful carrots from Trader Joe's. So there's purple, yellow, and orange in here, but you could do whatever you have. But this does add a lot of really pretty flavor. We're not gonna add the carrots until the very end. So I'm gonna be putting these in my fridge to hang out until we're ready. And the reason for that is because if you put them in and let them cook for 5 hours, they will be nothing. And that's how I used to cook this. I just used to put it all in and be done. You won't be able to tell that there's carrots. They will be complete mush. It still tastes good. There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that's what a stew is, really. It's just stewed and stewed until it's cooked into this unrecognizable thing, kind of. But if you want to have that color and that pop, then you can add these at the closer to the end and just cook them until tender, and it'll give your stew a more colorful look. So that is something I've been recently doing to give my stew more color. And I also don't add the turnips and potatoes until towards the end. Everything else goes in and cooks down to nothing. I'm gonna show you an overview of all these vegetables. At the end of this stew, you're gonna be like, there's vegetables in there? You won't be able to tell. It's crazy how many vegetables are packed into this stew. You can't tell at the end of it. So I just want to show you that, because it's like, you may be thinking, wow, I'm not getting any vegetables with this meal, but you're actually getting a lot. They're just cooked way down. And yes, that does cook the nutrition out of the vegetable itself, but you're cooking it into the liquid itself of the stew, so you are getting all of that nutrition when you eat something like this. Okay, so enough blabbing about that. I'm gonna show you an overview of this, and then we're gonna start actually getting this going. Last little note before I forget is that I definitely recommend, if you're gonna cook this for dinner, you probably want to start it around noon or really early afternoon. The longer that you can stew the meat, the better and more tender it will be. Stew meat does not have a lot of fat. It's very lean, and it also has a lot of collagen. It has a lot of tendons running through it, things like that. That's why it's a cheaper cut of meat. So that's why stewing is the best option for this cut of meat, because it is going to be tender by the end of the cooking period. So yeah, start it around noon or morning time if you can. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start by heating about 2 tablespoons of ghee in a Dutch oven. You can use any kind of oil. I just prefer to use ghee. Duck fat works really well and has a very good flavor. You could also use avocado oil, but I would avoid using olive oil. Once the ghee is melted and coating the bottom of the pan well, you will add your stew meat. So again, I'm cooking 2 pounds worth of stew meat. I have the heat on medium-low. This part of the cooking process, things can stick very easily, so stay close to it. Keep a tool handy that you can use to stir it. I like to use like a wooden type spoon. Just keep things moving pretty often during this part of the cooking process. I just want to get a little bit of browning on this meat before I go ahead and add my arrowroot starch. Now it's time to add the arrowroot starch. I do about 2 tablespoons of arrowroot starch for 2 pounds. So if you're doing 1 pound, you just do a tablespoon. You're going to want to coat all of the meat, and again, you might want to turn it down a little bit lower. I usually have it on pretty low because it's very easy for things to stick during this process. So again, don't leave it, stay very close. While the meat still has some redness in the center, I go ahead and add my onion. So I'm using just 1 large onion for this. Give it a good stir, let that cook for a few minutes. Meat is still a little bit red, and I'm going to add my celery. So this is dehydrated celery, so it looks really funny, but normally I use about 3 stalks per pound of meat. So this is actually close to that. It just looks different when it's dehydrated. During this step, things can also continue to stick if you're not careful and you don't stay close and keep stirring things. So you may have it on low to medium, somewhere in that range. So I just cook it until I kind of feel like the onions and celery have cooked a little bit and they're fragrant. And then I move on to the next step, which is adding the cabbage. So I'm adding the cabbage in, and then I'm going to give it a good stir and turn it on low and put the lid on. And I'm just going to let the cabbage wilt down. I'm adding a little bit of salt as well. I'm going to let the cabbage wilt down and just get a little bit of browning. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. Okay, so the cabbage has been cooking several minutes with the lid on. You can see a lot of the water is starting to be released. So sticking at this point gets a little less worrisome. So here it is, and this is kind of what it looks like. I'm going to cook it for a little bit with the lid off just to allow that cabbage to get more browning. When the lid is on, there's more of a steaming action happening, and so there's less ability for it to really get a browned exterior. I cooked it several minutes with the lid off. Now I'm adding in some fresh parsley. It also works just fine using dried. And now is the step where I'm going to add in 16 ounces of tomato sauce per pound. Now I'm going to bring this to a boil and then turn it as low as possible so that it's just at a simmer. So on my stove, I keep it at the very lowest setting possible and then put the lid on it. You want to let this cook for at least 30 minutes. Now, it can cook for much longer than that. For example, I actually have some going today on my stove, which is different from the day that I filmed this, but I've had it going since probably about 10:30 and it's now about 1:30, so it's been going quite a while just stewing that meat in the tomato sauce. I have had to add a little bit of broth to it already, but the longer you can let this cook, the better. It really can cook for a long time. Okay, it's getting closer to the time that I want to serve this. So now I'm going to add in my potatoes, my turnips, and my carrots. You could wait a little bit longer to add the carrots if you want, because they usually are going to cook faster than the potatoes and the turnips, especially depending on how you cut them. But I'm just dumping them all in today. But you could add potatoes and turnips first, let those get soft, then add your carrots. And the carrots will retain a little bit more color that way. This is also the point in which you will add your bone broth. So for 1 pound of stew, you use anywhere from 1 to 2 cups of broth. For me, I'm always at the lower end of the broth window. I just tend to like my stew a little bit thicker, so I encourage you to start with a lower amount of liquid and then see what you like. So now you're going to have to bring it back up to a boil and let it simmer until all the vegetables are tender. I also added in about 3 bay leaves. Okay, you can see the stew has been cooking a little bit. Things are starting to get tender and look really good. Once I get it at a steady simmer, I really only check it like every 20 minutes or so and just see how the vegetables are going along. It's not really something you can overcook. It just will make the vegetables look more mushy and they'll cook down more, and it's not going to impact flavor. It's just going to impact how it looks. I totally forgot to get some shots of us putting it into our bowls and serving it, but here's the finished product. You can see some of the cabbage did not cook down as much as I normally let it. So again, the longer you let it cook, the more those things are going to cook down. The full written recipe is on my blog if you prefer to read it, and it has more exact measurements and things like that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something today. Like, subscribe, comment, and thanks for sticking around.